Welcome to the Clutch Kitten Gaming Podcast, where I play an indie game for 5 hours and let you know whether or not it's worth your time and money. Hello and welcome everyone. This is James, also known as Clutch Kitten, and I am so happy that you're here for episode 44 of the show. I am not only stoked to be here podcasting, I am also so ready to talk about this week's game. It's from a studio that I love, and I couldn't get enough of it in this past week. Before we jump right into that though, let's touch on some listener questions and news. For those of you who don't already know, if you want to get your question read and answered on the show, you can shoot me an email to klutchkittengaming@gmail.com, or you can DM me on Instagram at klutchkittengaming. This week I'm going to answer a question from my good friend Sofa Gamers, who asks, what was the hardest game to beat, but at the same time gave you great satisfaction? Oh my gosh, beat is the key word here because I do this really terrible thing where I play a lot of games, but I don't roll credits on many of them. Even games like XCOM 2 and Skyrim, where I've started multiple playthroughs and have played the game a whole lot of hours, I haven't rolled credits on either of those. So, I'm just going to ignore that keyword and throw out a few examples of hard games that have also been super satisfying. First off, Darkest Dungeon. This is somehow one of those games that lures you in run after run, despite doing its very best to beat you down. Sure, there are good quirks that your units can get, but they also can go insane, become disease-ridden, and paralyzed in fear. They can even hurt the rest of your party as a result. Darkest Dungeon is punishingly hard, but oh man, it's so satisfying to play. Another game that comes to mind for me is The Messenger. As most of you are aware, I'm abysmally bad at platformers, so I think many games in that genre are inherently difficult for me. I've bounced off quite a few of them, but The Messenger, even in those sequences that were especially difficult, it managed to capture me. The soundtrack was amazing at roping me into the game, and the quick resets made my constant deaths feel a whole lot less bad. The third game I'll mention is Return of the Obra Dinn. I talked about this game on episode 35, and it's one that felt so unique in the way it played. It becomes incredibly difficult as you progress through the game, but each time you lock in 3 correct death deductions, it makes you feel like a genius. It kind of fulfills that fantasy of being a world-class detective like Sherlock Holmes in a way that not many other games have done. This question really got me wondering what these games are for each of you. So, make sure that when you email in your questions, also let me know what games you find to be incredibly difficult, yet worth the time. Now on to news. I will say right off the bat that I think politics are incredibly frustrating. No matter what side you're on, there is always so much negativity, and needless to say, I try to avoid talking about them at all costs, especially on the show. Today is different though because the news is about Microsoft, Nintendo of America, and Sony Interactive Entertainment. It's about how they issued a statement against President Trump's proposed 25% tariffs on consoles manufactured in China. That was a mouthful. Wow. This is a 7-page document that you're able to find online. You probably can just Google it. And it goes into a lot of detail on essentially why the tariffs are such a bad idea when it comes to gaming consoles. It talks about how the video game industry is a driver of economic growth and technological innovation in America. It discusses how consoles are highly specialized products with complex supply chains, and basically that trying to shift those chains away from China isn't really a feasible option. It then goes on to talk about how tariffs would also hurt smaller US developers and consumers alike. Even for those of you who dislike politics like me, you really should hop online and take a few minutes to read this document. There are tons of interesting facts about the industry, and it's cool seeing these companies speak out in defense of the US gaming market. Sure, their main goal is to save their own asses, but they make good arguments about how the tariffs will hurt the US gaming market. It will make consoles more expensive, which in turn will hurt the sale of games, which in turn will hurt all of the people developing games. These indie game developers that we love and that create such amazing masterpieces. Whether or not you're a supporter of Trump or even the tariffs on China in general, I'm sure that we can all agree that we'd like to avoid these tariffs getting placed on our entertainment. Let's move on now to this week's game. Today we're going to be talking about Hades, which is an isometric, rogue-like dungeon crawler based in hell. It's being developed by the one and only Supergiant Games, and is currently just available on the Epic Games Store. Now before we get too much further into our discussion, I need to mention a few quick things. First off, Greg over at Supergiant kindly provided me with a free copy of the game. For a while I had been debating whether or not to ask developers for review codes, mainly because I didn't want that to hurt the perceived value of my game reviews. But in the end, I realized that my reviews should speak for themselves. The most important thing to me is that I'm giving my honest opinions, and I have no problem doing that, whether I get a game for free or I purchase it for myself. Second, Hades is currently in early access. This isn't the first game I've looked at in early access, but it's worth mentioning because it is being patched at a pretty regular pace. My opinions on the game are being given based on the current patch, so there's a decent chance that any complaints I have could be addressed at some point before the official release. Third, I know it's currently exclusive to the Epic Store, but even if you're someone who hates everything to do with Epic, I would encourage you to stick around. Supergiant does have plans to bring Hades to other platforms, so if you refuse to buy it on Epic's store, I'm sure it will be available somewhere else at some point in the future. Hades was put out in early access in December of 2018, and as we mentioned already, it's being developed by Supergiant Games. Supergiant is based in San Francisco and was founded by Amir Rao and Gavin Simon. Sorry Amir if I mispronounced your last name. And they founded it in 2009. Both of these guys actually came from working at EA on the Command & Conquer series, and they decided to start their own studio. Since then, they and the rest of their team have developed 3 other games before Hades: Bastion, Transistor, and Pyre, all of which have received a ton of praise in the indie space. If you want to learn more about what the studio is like today, I would definitely recommend heading over to check out the no-clip documentary about the development of Hades. My friend Haley recommended that I check it out, and I was very glad that I did. It's a super cool look into the inner workings of the studio and what it's actually like. Currently Hades costs $24.99, and I'm actually not exactly sure how long it will take to beat. What I can say though is that generally this genre is built for replayability, and I think Hades is no exception. Unless you're an absolute god with your Hades mechanics, you should be able to get many hours of gameplay out of this game. In terms of controls, I personally used my Xbox 360 controller, and my assumption is that the gamepad is the best way to play. That being said, I haven't tried mouse and keyboard. I just know that controller has tended to be the best way to play Supergiant games in the past, and Hades seems to be riding that same line. Let's move on now to talk about the narrative. You know, most people would assume that being a demigod and having a dad, who is literally a god, would be completely righteous. But the fact of the matter is, the situation is hell. Haha, yes, my dad is Hades, I get the pun, but for reals, being stuck in the underworld sucks. It is cool being in such a metal place with a pet that's a 3-headed dog, but at a certain point, it becomes pretty tiring. Life here is a flaming mess of drama. So, I've finally decided to get the heck out. At first glance, Hades might seem like a cut and dry experience. It may seem like another one of those games where you battle your way through hell trying to defeat the big bad. I mean, we just talked about another game like this in Book of Demons. However, it's important to note that Hades is actually a much more personal journey. It's not about fighting your way to the deepest level of the underworld, it's about fighting your way out. You play as Zagreus, the prince of the underworld and the son of Hades. I tried to do some research on the actual mythos of Zagreus in Greek lore, and I'll be honest, I got incredibly confused. The point is that you should be happy with your living situation, right? I mean, you're destined to take over the underworld at some point, and you have to admit that's pretty cool. That's not the case though. You come to find out that the underworld is almost like a hotter and more god-awful version of Jersey Shore. It's a drama fest. To kick things off, your father gets real pissy when you mention that you want to leave the underworld. Later on, you learn some crazy news about your mother, and from there, the drama just spirals down and down. Something I've grown to love about Supergiant is their superb talent in world building. I also admire their incredible ability to create an immersive world which can be consumed at the level of your choice. What I mean by this is that if you're the type of person who could give less of a fuck about story because you just want to play a fun roguelike, you can ignore a large portion of the lore and story building. However, if you're the type of person who finds a lot of value in your gaming experiences through knowing more about the world, Supergiant gives you that option. Every time you die in your attempted escape, you wind up back in the throne room. You emerge from a pool of blood like it's an everyday occurrence, and you have the choice to run straight for your room to prepare for the next run, or you can walk around the throne room interacting with those present. You can pet your three-headed dog Cerberus, you can be scolded by your father, you can be encouraged by your caretaker Nyx, and you can learn more about your journey from your mentor and friend Achilles. There are also tons of areas in and out of runs that you can interact with to get extra pieces of lore. All in all, I'm unsurprisingly enamored by the world Supergiant built. They've done a great job of bringing Greek mythology to life, and I think that taking the dysfunctional family angle was a really smart and unique choice. Since they don't have any narrative complaints, let's move on to gameplay. Like with Gato Roboto, let's not spend too much time rehashing the basics of a roguelike. In Hades, there's permadeath, there's procedural generation of dungeons, and there's both in-run and permanent progression. So how is the combat, and do the progression systems support a fun and replayable experience? In terms of combat, if you've played Transistor, Hades will feel very familiar apart from there being no time manipulation. You have a basic attack, a dash, an ability, which in the case of the sword is an area attack which pushes enemies away, and you also have a cast which shoots out a blood-like projectile. All in all, the combat is really enjoyable, and the progression really allows you to play whatever style that you want. If you like getting up close and personal with enemies, try using your sword. If you enjoy doing damage from afar, try out the bow. If you want to feel like Captain America, try out the shield. Also, the way you end up building your character over the course of a run can really change up your playstyle as well. Let's look at how the in-run progression works. The cool thing about your family drama is that it extends much further than the underworld. In fact, there are actually a lot of people rooting for your escape. Zeus, Aphrodite, Hermes, and many other gods and goddesses want you to get out. As such, they offer their help from time to time as you work your way out of the underworld. Your playstyle ends up being heavily affected by the relatives that help you out on a given run. For example, if Zeus comes to your aid, he'll offer you one of three choices. You might be able to electrify your basic attacks, or cause your dashes to leave a trail of electricity, or you might want to electrify your projectile cast. Zeus offers a lot of aggressive powers that provide strength, whereas when someone like Aphrodite helps you, she often improves your abilities by giving them weakness and charm debuffs. Maybe if you get hit, An enemy will become weak for 3 seconds and do less damage to you. The ability improvements in Hades actually ended up feeling a lot like the modifiers you can equip to Red and Transistor. I have to say that it's so hard not to dive deep into the intricacies of combat in this game. There are many small systems and mechanics which differentiate the Hades combat from Transistor, but we don't have the time to talk about all of them. So let's summarize with the overall strengths and weaknesses of the Hades gameplay. First off, in terms of strengths, the gameplay loop is fulfilling and replayable. Not only are there a decent variety of weapons to choose from, but there are also quite a few different modifiers that you can get from the different gods and goddesses. Second, combat has an amazing flow. It's fast-paced and satisfying, and I love how mobile you can be in each arena. Third, I appreciated the choice you get in many of the dungeons. After you clear a room of enemies, there often are 2 or 3 doors that you can exit through. What's especially cool is that most of the time, you get to see a preview of the reward for each room before you make your choice. Why I found that to be so refreshing is that it addresses one of the more annoying aspects of roguelikes, RNG. Although the randomness of procedural generation is part of what makes the genre replayable, it can also introduce frustration because of the lack of player agency. The ability to at least choose your reward in the next dungeon is at least a step in the right direction. You still may end up walking into a room that you're unequipped to deal with, but at least you chose that room knowing what you would be getting. In terms of gameplay weaknesses, I only see a few. First off, I've never been the biggest fan of the Supergiant projectile targeting. What I'm trying to say is that shooting bows and projectiles doesn't always feel quite right. Instead of having full agency over the direction you shoot, it feels like the game locks you into only so many angles. It's not the end of the world, and maybe it will be improved as they continue to work on the game, but it did stand out as an annoyance at times. Second, I wanted more variety in dungeons. The majority of the rooms you enter into are just combat arenas. You either have to kill all the enemies or survive for a certain amount of time. There is also a store that you sometimes run into, and a few secret rooms, but I think the game would just improve with some added diversity from room to room. Luckily, this seems like something that will just continue to improve over the course of it being in early access. To conclude our gameplay section, all in all, I was not disappointed by the gameplay loop. The combat feels similar to Transistor, and honestly, that's completely fine. It's a lot of fun to play, and I think the new systems they added make the game even better. Now that we've made it through the narrative and gameplay, let's touch on the art and sound design. On the art side, this game is absolutely stunning. It has a very similar style to Transistor, although one pretty big difference I noticed was that the art in Hades is much more bold and punchy, whereas Transistor had more of a painterly and soft style. You may prefer one style over the other a little bit more, but all in all, the visuals are stylistic, aesthetic, and skillfully done. Sound design wise, Supergiant also hit it out of the park. They've always done an excellent job with VO, and Hades is no exception. I found the voiceover to be convincing in the way it drew me more deeply into the world. The art and sound design go hand in hand with the narrative in the way that they can't help but make you feel like you're a part of what's happening. When you're in the throne room and are listening to Hades going off on what a disappointment his son is, it doesn't feel like you're playing the game. It feels like you're hiding behind a curtain in the next room, listening to a family drama unfold. When it comes to the soundtrack, I actually was a bit surprised. What's interesting is that the tracks span a lot of different genres. Yet, at the same time, they all share threads of Grecian influence. For example, one moment you might be listening to a sort of Grecian post-rock, then, in the next room, you're greeted by fast-paced, almost doom-like metal. Then, you move on to a dungeon with some grungy music like in Road Redemption. The point is that I think the soundtrack is well done, but there are points where I believe the transitions need to be sanded down and smoothed out. Now that we've made it through the narrative, gameplay, art and sound design, let's summarize with some positives and negatives. First off, on the positive side, Supergiant's story development and world building is top tier. It's not aggressive, it's not annoying, it's not shallow. It provides a breath of fresh air after a difficult run, it provides comedic relief, it provides a reward for playing the game beyond just progressing in the dungeons. Second, the gameplay loop is well designed. Progression comes at a steady pace, and combat is high energy and well balanced. Third, the art and VO do an amazing job of rounding out the game. They're the icing and sprinkles to an already delicious cake. On the negative side, I only have a few small complaints. First off, I would like to see some improvements to the aiming system. It's not broken by any means, but I think it would play better if it was smoothed out and more free-form. Second, I think the replayability factor would be off the charts if some additional room types were added. Third, although the soundtrack's individual songs are good, their placement and flow within the game didn't always make the most sense to me. We made it now to the final boss. This is the part of the podcast where I let you know whether you should slay the game and buy it, flee the game and avoid it, or farm up and wait for a sale. My verdict is to slay this game. Supergiant has shown and continues to show their aptitude for developing amazing games in their style over a variety of genres. Now that they've developed Hades, they can cross rogue-lik off their list and be proud of the title they've produced. Even if you're not the biggest fan of this genre, I want to encourage you to check this game out and to support this studio as a whole. It's shops like this that really push what excellence means in the indie space. As always, thank you all so much for taking the time to listen in. If you enjoy what you hear, make sure you tell a friend about it, and make sure you let me know when you play the games that I've reviewed. I want to hear your thoughts and opinions as well. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day, and I'll see you in game.